The first hiker to disappear on the Crooked Ridge Trail vanished on a crisp October morning in 1826, when traveling merchant Josiah Whitlock set out from the settlement of Pine Hollow with a full pack and enough provisions for a week-long journey through the Appalachian wilderness. What made Whitlock's disappearance particularly disturbing was not simply that he failed to reach his destination in the neighboring valley, but that other travelers on the same mountain path reported encountering a woman who claimed to be his wife, asking if they had seen her husband while displaying an intimate knowledge of his travel plans and personal habits that no stranger should have possessed. The Crooked Ridge Trail had been used by Cherokee hunters for generations, before European settlers began following its winding path through the dense forests and rocky outcroppings that characterized the remote mountains of western Virginia. The trail connected several small farming communities that had been established in the fertile valleys, providing the only reliable route for trade and communication between settlements that were separated by treacherous terrain and days of difficult travel. Local residents had always known that the Crooked Ridge Trail demanded respect from those who ventured onto its narrow paths and steep ascents, but the dangers they warned travelers about were the ordinary hazards of mountain travel: sudden weather changes, unstable rock faces, and the occasional black bear or wildcat that might be encountered in the deeper wilderness areas. None of the longtime residents had ever spoken of supernatural threats or mysterious women who appeared to lost hikers with offers of assistance that led not to safety, but to something far more sinister. The woman who had approached other travelers asking about Josiah Whitlock was described consistently by multiple witnesses as being tall and gaunt, with prematurely gray hair and clothing that seemed too light for the mountain climate. She moved through the forest with an unnatural ease that suggested intimate familiarity with every root and stone along the trail, appearing suddenly from dense undergrowth without making any of the sounds that normally accompanied human passage through heavy woodland. Have you ever encountered someone on a hiking trail who seemed to know too much about your plans, or felt like you were being followed through wilderness areas where no one else should have been? Drop a comment below and share your experiences with strange encounters in remote locations. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories from America's haunted wilderness. What made the encounters with the mysterious woman even more unsettling was her apparent knowledge of details about Whitlock's journey that she could not have obtained through casual observation or conversation with other travelers. She knew the specific route he had planned to take through the mountains, the names of people he intended to visit in the distant valley, and even personal information about his family and business affairs that suggested either supernatural insight or prolonged surveillance of his activities. The woman's questions about Whitlock were delivered with an emotional intensity that suggested deep personal concern, but her physical appearance and behavior created an atmosphere of dread that made other travelers eager to end their encounters with her as quickly as possible. She would appear without warning alongside the trail, stepping out from behind trees or emerging from rocky crevices with the fluid motion of someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to human society. Her voice carried an unusual quality that witnesses found difficult to describe precisely, but which seemed to echo slightly even in open air, as if her words were being repeated by invisible speakers hidden throughout the surrounding forest. When she spoke Whitlock's name, it was with a familiarity that suggested intimate knowledge of his character and habits, yet also with an undercurrent of something that might have been hunger or anticipation, rather than genuine concern for his welfare. The search parties that were organized to look for the missing merchant found no trace of him along the established trail or in any of the areas where travelers occasionally camped for the night. His planned route was thoroughly explored by experienced woodsmen who knew every landmark and shelter along the path, but they discovered no evidence that Whitlock had ever passed through the locations where his journey should have taken him. More disturbing still was the discovery that the mysterious woman continued to appear to other travelers, even after it became clear that Whitlock would never reach his intended destination. She would emerge from the forest to ask the same questions about his whereabouts, displaying the same detailed knowledge of his travel plans and the same emotional intensity that had characterized her earlier encounters with people who had met her before his disappearance. The second hiker to vanish on the Crooked Ridge Trail was Mordecai Blackwood, a circuit preacher who made regular journeys through the mountain communities to conduct religious services and perform weddings and funerals in settlements that were too small to support their own ministers. Blackwood was known throughout the region as a man of deep faith and practical wisdom who had traveled the mountain trails for over a decade without ever encountering difficulties that he could not overcome through prayer and careful preparation. When Blackwood failed to arrive at his scheduled destination in early November, the residents of Pine Hollow organized another search effort, this time with the grim understanding that they were dealing with something more than ordinary travel mishaps or bad weather. The search parties included men who had participated in the hunt for Josiah Whitlock, and they approached their task with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that lives might depend on their ability to discover what was happening to travelers on the Crooked Ridge Trail. The searchers found evidence that Blackwood had made it approximately halfway along his intended route before something interrupted his journey. His distinctive walking stick was discovered beside the trail, along with a small leather Bible that he always carried during his travels. But there were no signs of struggle or violence, no indication that he had been attacked by wild animals or human assailants. His belongings were arranged with the same unnatural neatness that had characterized the complete absence of evidence in Whitlock's disappearance. More unsettling still was the discovery that the mysterious woman had been seen asking about Blackwood even before he had departed on his final journey. Witnesses reported encounters with her in the days leading up to the preacher's disappearance, during which she had demonstrated the same detailed knowledge of his travel plans and personal history that had marked her inquiries about the missing merchant. The woman's questions about Blackwood revealed information that no casual observer could have obtained through normal means. She knew about his family background, his religious training, and even specific details about the communities he planned to visit during his mountain circuit. Her inquiries were delivered with the same emotional intensity and physical presence that had characterized her earlier appearances, but witnesses noted that her demeanor seemed somehow more confident, as if previous experience had taught her to be more effective in her mysterious activities. Temperance Hartwell, the school teacher in Pine Hollow, was among the first to suggest that the disappearances might be connected to supernatural forces rather than ordinary criminal activity or natural hazards. Miss Hartwell had grown up listening to Cherokee stories about the mountains, and she recognized similarities between the mysterious woman and traditional accounts of spirits that were believed to prey on travelers who ventured too far from established settlements. According to the Cherokee legends that Miss Hartwell had learned from elderly tribal members who still lived in the region, certain places in the mountains were home to entities that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These spirits were drawn to travelers who were separated from their communities, offering assistance and companionship that seemed genuine, but ultimately led to transformation or disappearance rather than safe passage to intended destinations. The Cherokee stories described these entities as beings that had once been human, but had become something else through prolonged exposure to the supernatural forces that permeated certain locations in the wilderness. They retained enough of their original humanity to understand and manipulate human emotions and desires, but their fundamental nature had been altered in ways that made them dangerous to living people who accepted their offers of help or guidance. Miss Hartwell's interpretation of the disappearances gained credibility when other residents of Pine Hollow began to recall additional encounters with the mysterious woman that had occurred over a longer period than anyone had initially realized. Careful questioning revealed that she had been seen in the area for several years, always asking about specific travelers and always displaying the same unnatural knowledge of their personal details and travel plans. The pattern that emerged from these recollections suggested that the woman had been gradually becoming more active and more effective in whatever she was attempting to accomplish through her interactions with hikers on the Crooked Ridge Trail. Early encounters had been brief and relatively innocuous, but recent appearances had been longer and more intense, as if she was developing skills or confidence that allowed her to engage more directly with potential victims. The third disappearance occurred in late November when Silas Crawford, a young man from the neighboring valley, set out on what should have been a routine journey to visit relatives in Pine Hollow. Crawford was familiar with the Crooked Ridge Trail and had traveled it safely on several previous occasions. But he failed to arrive at his destination, despite carrying enough supplies for the 2-day journey and setting out in favorable weather conditions. The search for Crawford was complicated by a heavy snowfall that covered the trail and obscured any tracks or signs that might have indicated the direction of his travel. But even after the snow melted and the trail became accessible again, no trace of the missing man was found along his intended route or in any of the areas where he might have sought shelter during the storm. What made Crawford's disappearance particularly significant was a letter that was discovered in his room several days after he had failed to return home. The letter was addressed to his sister and described his growing unease about the journey he was planning to undertake, specifically mentioning dreams in which he had encountered a woman on the mountain trail who seemed to know details about his life that he had never shared with anyone. According to the letter, Crawford had experienced these dreams repeatedly in the weeks leading up to his departure, and they had become increasingly vivid and disturbing. The dream woman would approach him on the trail and engage him in conversations that seemed friendly and helpful, but which left him with a sense of dread that persisted even after he awakened. She would offer to guide him to shortcuts that would make his journey easier, or suggest places where he could find shelter and rest more comfortably than in the established camping areas along the trail. Crawford's letter revealed that he had initially dismissed these dreams as products of anxiety about his upcoming travels, but their persistence and increasing detail had begun to convince him that they might represent some form of supernatural warning or premonition. He wrote that the dream woman seemed to be drawing him towards something that he could not identify, but which filled him with a terror that was unlike anything he had ever experienced in waking life. The discovery of Crawford's letter provided the first direct evidence that the mysterious woman was actively reaching out to potential victims before they encountered her on the trail, using dreams or visions to establish contact and begin the process of manipulation that would eventually lead to their disappearances. This supernatural capability suggested that she possessed powers that exceeded those of ordinary human beings, and that traditional methods of avoiding or escaping from her influence might be ineffective. The realization that the entity haunting the Crooked Ridge Trail could influence people's dreams and mental states created a new level of fear among the mountain communities, as it meant that simply avoiding the trail might not be sufficient protection against her activities. If she could reach out to potential victims while they slept in their own homes, then no one in the region was truly safe from her supernatural predation. The fourth disappearance followed a pattern that was becoming disturbingly familiar to the residents of Pine Hollow and the surrounding settlements. Prudence Thornfield, a young woman who was traveling to be married in a distant valley, vanished from the Crooked Ridge Trail in early December, despite being accompanied by 2 male relatives who were serving as her escorts and protectors during the dangerous mountain journey. What made Thornfield's disappearance unique was that her companions survived to provide first-hand accounts of their encounter with the mysterious woman, though their testimony raised more questions than it answered about the nature of the supernatural entity that was claiming victims along the mountain trail. According to their statements, the woman had approached their small party during the afternoon hours while they were resting at one of the established camping areas along the trail. The woman had initially seemed to be another traveler who was seeking companionship and assistance, offering to share information about trail conditions and weather patterns that might affect their journey. But as the conversation continued, Thornfield's escorts began to realize that their new acquaintance possessed knowledge about their travel plans and personal circumstances that she could not have obtained through normal means. More disturbing still was the woman's apparent focus on Prudence Thornfield herself, asking detailed questions about the young woman's background, her intended marriage, and her feelings about leaving her family to begin a new life in an unfamiliar community. The escorts reported that these inquiries were delivered with an intensity and intimacy that seemed inappropriate for a casual conversation between strangers, and that Thornfield herself had seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the exchange continued. The supernatural encounter reached its climax when the mysterious woman offered to show Thornfield a shortcut that would allow the party to reach their destination more quickly and avoid a section of the trail that was known to be particularly dangerous during winter weather conditions. Despite the protests of her male companions, Thornfield had agreed to follow the woman's guidance, apparently having fallen under some form of supernatural influence that overcame her natural caution and the advice of her protectors. The escorts reported that they had followed Thornfield and the mysterious woman for a short distance along what appeared to be a legitimate trail, but which gradually led them deeper into unmarked wilderness that bore no resemblance to any established route through the mountains. When they called out warnings and demanded that the women return to the main trail, the mysterious woman had turned to face them with an expression that one of the escorts later described as not entirely human in its malevolence and hunger. At that moment, both Thornfield and the mysterious woman had simply vanished from sight, disappearing so completely and suddenly that the escorts were left staring at empty forest with no indication of where the two women had gone or how their disappearance had been accomplished. The men had searched the area thoroughly and called out for Thornfield repeatedly, but they had received no response and found no trace of either woman. The escorts had returned to Pine Hollow with their account of supernatural abduction, but their story was met with skepticism by some residents who found it difficult to believe that two adult women could simply disappear into thin air without leaving any physical evidence of their passage. Search parties were organized and the area described by the escorts was thoroughly explored, but no sign of Thornfield or the mysterious woman was ever discovered. The testimony of Thornfield's escorts provided the most detailed description of the mysterious woman that had yet been obtained, and their account revealed disturbing details about her physical appearance and behavior that suggested she was indeed something other than an ordinary human being. They described her as tall and unnaturally thin, with skin that seemed too pale for someone who spent significant time in the mountain wilderness, and eyes that reflected light in ways that suggested they possessed depths that normal human vision could not encompass. More unsettling still was their description of the woman's voice and manner of speaking, which they characterized as simultaneously familiar and alien, as if she were using words and phrases that belonged to human language but were being generated by something that did not entirely understand their meaning or emotional significance. Her offers of assistance and guidance had been delivered with perfect grammar and appropriate social conventions, but with an underlying quality that suggested these behaviors were learned rather than natural. The escorts also reported that the mysterious woman had seemed to know details about all three members of their party that she could not have obtained through observation or casual inquiry. She had mentioned specific names, places, and events from their personal histories with an accuracy that suggested either supernatural insight or prolonged surveillance of their activities. This knowledge had been woven into her conversation so naturally that its impossibility had not been immediately apparent, but in retrospect it provided clear evidence of her inhuman nature. As winter deepened and the Crooked Ridge Trail became increasingly dangerous for ordinary travelers, the mysterious woman's activities seemed to intensify rather than diminish. Residents of the mountain communities reported more frequent sightings of her in areas that had previously been considered safe, and her appearances began to occur closer to established settlements rather than being confined to the remote wilderness sections of the trail. These expanded activities suggested that the entity was growing stronger or more confident with each successful abduction, and that her supernatural capabilities were developing in ways that would make her increasingly difficult to avoid or resist. The dreams and visions that had initially been experienced only by potential victims began to affect other residents of the region, creating a climate of fear and unease that pervaded all aspects of daily life in the mountain communities. The breakthrough in understanding the nature of the supernatural threat came from an unexpected source. Ezekiel Morrison, an elderly Cherokee medicine man who lived in a small cabin near the headwaters of the creek that flowed through Pine Hollow. Morrison had been observing the disappearances with growing concern, recognizing patterns and characteristics that connected the current events to traditional tribal knowledge about supernatural entities that had haunted the region for generations. According to Morrison's account, the mysterious woman was what the Cherokee called a soul stealer, a spirit that had once been human but had been transformed through exposure to dark supernatural forces that existed in certain locations throughout the mountain wilderness. These entities retained enough of their original human nature to understand and manipulate the emotions and desires of living people, but their fundamental purpose was to harvest human consciousness and spiritual energy for reasons that remained mysterious even to traditional tribal wisdom. Morrison explained that soul stealers were drawn to travelers and isolated individuals because such people were temporarily separated from the protective influence of their communities and families. The entity would approach potential victims with offers of assistance and companionship that seemed genuine and helpful, but which were actually designed to create emotional connections that could be exploited to lure victims away from safety and into supernatural traps that would allow the harvesting process to begin. The Cherokee medicine man revealed that the supernatural entity currently active on the Crooked Ridge Trail was likely the spirit of a woman who had died in the mountains under circumstances that had prevented her from completing her natural transition to the realm of the dead. Instead of moving on to whatever afterlife awaited departed souls, she had become trapped in the spaces between life and death, where prolonged exposure to supernatural forces had gradually transformed her into something that required the spiritual energy of living people to maintain its existence. Morrison's explanation provided a framework for understanding the escalating pattern of disappearances, but it also revealed that the threat posed by the soul stealer was likely to continue expanding unless active measures were taken to either destroy the entity or force it to complete its interrupted transition to the realm of the dead. The Cherokee traditions included methods for dealing with such supernatural threats, but they required careful preparation and the cooperation of the entire affected community. The medicine man's proposed solution involved a ritual confrontation with the soul stealer that would force her to reveal her original identity and the circumstances that had led to her transformation. If successful, this ritual would provide the knowledge necessary to help her complete her interrupted spiritual journey, thereby ending her need to harvest the life energy of living people and removing the supernatural threat from the mountain trail. But Morrison warned that the ritual would be extremely dangerous for anyone who participated, as it would require direct contact with the soul stealer under conditions where her supernatural powers would be at their strongest. The participants would need to resist her attempts to manipulate their emotions and perceptions while gathering the information necessary to understand her true nature and needs. The volunteers who agreed to participate in Morrison's ritual included Samuel Hartwell, Temperance Hartwell's brother, Thomas Whitlock, cousin of the vanished merchant, and Rebecca Crawford, sister of the missing young man. These individuals had been selected because their personal connections to the disappeared hikers provided them with emotional motivations that would help them resist the soul stealer's supernatural influence, while their intimate knowledge of the victims would allow them to recognize any deceptions or false information the entity might attempt to provide. The ritual was planned for the winter solstice, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was believed to be at its thinnest, creating conditions that would allow the soul stealer to manifest more completely while also making it possible for living people to perceive and interact with supernatural entities that normally remained invisible to ordinary human senses. Morrison's preparations for the confrontation included the creation of protective talismans and the gathering of sacred plants that were believed to ward off supernatural influence. But he made it clear that these measures would provide only limited protection against an entity as powerful and experienced as the soul stealer had become. The ultimate success of the ritual would depend on the courage and determination of the human participants and their willingness to risk their own lives and spiritual well-being to end the threat to their community. The ritual confrontation took place on a moonless night at the location on the Crooked Ridge Trail, where Prudence Thornfield had disappeared, chosen because it was the site where the soul stealer had most recently demonstrated her full supernatural capabilities. The participants approached the area with a mixture of determination and terror, knowing that they were deliberately seeking out an entity that had already claimed multiple victims and would certainly attempt to add them to her collection of harvested souls. The soul stealer's manifestation began gradually, with subtle changes in the atmosphere and temperature that indicated the presence of supernatural forces. The participants reported feeling watched by invisible observers, and hearing faint sounds that resembled human voices calling from impossible distances. As the ritual progressed, these phenomena intensified until the mysterious woman finally appeared among them, with the same sudden materialization that had characterized her previous encounters with travelers on the trail. The Soul Stealer's manifestation began gradually, with subtle changes in the atmosphere and temperature that indicated the presence of supernatural forces. The participants reported feeling watched by invisible observers and hearing faint sounds that resembled human voices calling from impossible distances. As the ritual progressed, these phenomena intensified until the mysterious woman finally appeared among them, with the same sudden materialization that had characterized her previous encounters with travelers on the trail. But on this occasion, the Soul Stealer's appearance was different from the relatively normal human form she had presented to previous victims. The ritual conditions allowed the participants to perceive her true supernatural nature, revealing aspects of her existence that had been concealed during her earlier predatory activities. She appeared as a figure that was simultaneously solid and translucent, with features that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely, depending on the angle from which she was observed. The entity's voice carried qualities that made it clear she was no longer entirely human, resonating with harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources, and speaking words that conveyed meaning directly to the listener's consciousness, rather than through normal auditory processing. When she spoke, it was with the accumulated knowledge and personality traits of all the victims she had claimed over the years, creating a composite identity that contained elements of Josiah Whitlock, Mordecai Blackwood, Silas Crawford, Prudence Thornfield, and others whose disappearances had not been discovered or reported. Through the ritual dialogue, the participants learned that the Soul Stealer had originally been a woman named Charity Blackwood, the sister of a Cherokee trader who had married into the local settler community during the early 1800s. Charity had died during a harsh winter while attempting to travel alone through the mountains to reach her brother's trading post, but her death had occurred at a location where supernatural forces were particularly strong, preventing her spirit from completing its natural transition to the afterlife. The prolonged exposure to these supernatural forces had gradually corrupted Charity's spiritual essence, transforming her from a lost soul seeking help into a predatory entity that required the life energy of living people to maintain its existence in the spaces between worlds. Each victim, she claimed, added their memories, knowledge, and personality traits to her own consciousness, creating a composite being that became more complex and powerful with every successful harvest. The ritual revealed that Charity's transformation into a soul stealer had been a gradual process that had taken place over decades, during which she had learned to use her supernatural abilities more effectively and to target victims with greater precision and success. The recent escalation in disappearances reflected her growing skill and confidence, as well as her increasing need for spiritual energy to maintain her existence, as the supernatural forces that sustained her gradually demanded greater and greater sacrifices. But the ritual also revealed that Charity retained enough of her original human consciousness to understand the horror of what she had become, and to desire release from her supernatural existence. The Soul Stealer's predatory activities were not driven by malevolence or hatred toward living people, but by an overwhelming compulsion to harvest the spiritual energy necessary for her continued existence, combined with a desperate hope that accumulating enough human consciousness might eventually provide her with the knowledge or power necessary to complete her interrupted transition to the afterlife. The participants in the ritual learned that Charity could be helped to complete her spiritual journey, but only through a process that would require them to voluntarily share their own life energy with her, providing the spiritual resources necessary for her transition, while accepting the risk that the process might drain too much of their own vitality for them to survive the experience. The decision facing the ritual participants was whether to attempt this dangerous process of spiritual healing, or to use the knowledge they had gained to find other methods of ending Charity's supernatural threat to the mountain communities. Morrison had prepared both options, but he warned that any solution would require significant personal sacrifice from those who were willing to help resolve the situation. Samuel Hartwell, whose sister had been the first to recognize the supernatural nature of the disappearances, volunteered to serve as the primary conduit for the spiritual healing process. His decision was motivated by a combination of guilt over his failure to protect the disappeared hikers and a recognition that his family's educational background and community standing gave him both the capability and the responsibility to take the most dangerous role in ending the supernatural threat. The healing ritual required Hartwell to establish direct spiritual contact with Charity's corrupted consciousness, allowing her to draw upon his life energy while he used his own spiritual strength to guide her toward the completion of her interrupted transition to the afterlife. The process was agonizing for both participants as it required Charity to release her accumulated harvest of stolen souls, while Hartwell experienced the combined trauma and spiritual damage that had transformed her into a supernatural predator. But the ritual was ultimately successful, allowing Charity Blackwood's spirit to complete its long-delayed journey to the realm of the dead, while simultaneously releasing all of the victims she had claimed over the years. The souls of Josiah Whitlock, Mordecai Blackwood, Silas Crawford, Prudence Thornfield, and others materialized briefly during the healing process, expressing gratitude for their liberation before continuing their own transitions to whatever afterlife awaited them. Samuel Hartwell survived the healing ritual, but the experience left him permanently changed by his exposure to the supernatural forces and accumulated trauma that had corrupted Charity's spirit. He aged rapidly over the following months and died within a year of the confrontation, though his death was peaceful and seemed to be the result of spiritual exhaustion rather than any form of supernatural corruption or influence. The successful resolution of the Soul Stealer threat brought an end to the mysterious disappearances on the Crooked Ridge Trail. But it also served as a sobering reminder to the mountain communities about the supernatural dangers that existed in their remote wilderness areas. The Cherokee medicine man, Ezekiel Morrison, used the experience to teach younger members of the community about traditional methods for recognizing and dealing with supernatural entities, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to protect themselves and their neighbors from similar threats. The story of Charity Blackwood and her transformation into a soul stealer became part of the oral tradition of the region, serving both as a cautionary tale about the dangers of traveling alone in the mountains and as a testament to the power of community cooperation and personal sacrifice in overcoming supernatural threats. The Crooked Ridge Trail was eventually renamed the Charity Trail in honor of the woman whose tormented spirit had haunted it for so many years and whose final liberation had required the courage and compassion of people who were willing to risk their own lives to help a lost soul find peace. Modern hikers who use the trail system that has developed in the region over the past 2 centuries occasionally report encounters with a tall, gaunt woman who seems to know more about their travel plans than any stranger should, but these sightings are generally brief and non-threatening. Some researchers believe that these contemporary encounters represent residual supernatural energy from Charity's long haunting of the area, while others maintain that they are simply cases of mistaken identity or psychological suggestion influenced by knowledge of the historical events. The Cherokee descendants who still live in the region maintain traditional protective practices when traveling in the mountains, carrying sacred items and following ritual procedures that are believed to ward off supernatural influence. These practices have proven effective in preventing any recurrence of the soul stealer phenomenon, though tribal elders continue to teach younger generations about the importance of maintaining proper spiritual defenses when venturing into areas where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead remains thin. The location where the healing ritual took place is marked by a small stone cairn that was erected by Morrison and the surviving participants as a memorial to both Charity Blackwood and Samuel Hartwell. The cairn serves as a reminder of the events that took place there, and as a warning to future travelers about the importance of respecting the supernatural forces that continue to influence certain areas of the Appalachian wilderness. Contemporary paranormal investigators who have studied the historical records and interviewed elderly residents of the region have documented several cases of similar supernatural entities in other parts of the Appalachian mountain system, suggesting that the soul stealer phenomenon may be more widespread than the isolated incident at Crooked Ridge. These researchers have developed protocols based on Cherokee traditional knowledge and the experiences of the 1826 ritual participants, creating resources that can be used by communities that encounter similar supernatural threats. If this chilling tale of the Appalachian soul stealer, who hunted hikers for over 2 decades, sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling stories from America's haunted wilderness. Have you or someone you know ever encountered mysterious strangers on mountain trails who seem to know too much about your travel plans, or experienced dreams about supernatural entities before venturing into remote areas? Share your experiences with mountain hauntings and unexplained encounters in the comments below. We're always fascinated by stories of the supernatural forces that continue to influence our wilderness areas.